So I first want to start off by saying that I'm not Native Hawaiian. I grew up as a settler on Hawaiian land that was illegally seized by the United States. So I wanted to first recognize all the Hawaiian educators I had throughout my life that I was lucky enough to learn from, and their patience with me as I went through a little bit of a conservative phase. But I hope I can pass their knowledge along here to you guys today. So we're going to start with some Marxism. In Capital Volume 1, Marx writes that capital and the system of capitalism came into the world dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. If capitalism was the best system for humanity, it would have been embraced by those whose lives were transformed by this new wonderful way of living. However, at almost every step of the way, capitalism has been resisted, especially by the original inhabitants of the lands worldwide, Native and Indigenous peoples. So today I want to discuss capitalism as the root of the current climate crisis, and specifically the ways in which it has utterly destroyed the islands and culture of Hawaii. First, I want to briefly frame the intersection of capitalism, indigenous struggle, and climate collapse in a Marxist understanding. I will then take a closer look at these concepts and how they played out in the conquest and occupation of the Hawaiian nation, and the ways that American imperialism and exploitation have been resisted in Hawaii over the past few hundred years. As Marxists, we understand that the oppression of Native peoples and their subsequent resistance of the past few centuries is shaped by the dispossession of their land and resources. We know that this country is a settler colonial project built on the backs of enslaved African people, the genocide and displacement of the Native population, and the exploitation of all workers. We also know that the role of the government in a capitalist state is not to protect or enhance the lives of the people, but rather to advance the interests of big business, capital, and the rich. Capitalism is especially destructive to the planet because it breaks the connection between people and the natural world that sustains us, in the same way that it breaks our connection between ourselves and our labor. Marx describes capitalism's relationship to the land as that as a vampire, parasitic and exploitative. A capitalist may own a large amount of land, but if they destroy it for a profit, for example, through like fracking, drilling, etc., they can simply take the profits and buy more land elsewhere. The land and resources are just a means to an end, and therefore they're disposable in the pursuit of capital. Marxism gives us a method and a political understanding of how capitalism works and how we need the activity of workers and the oppressed to change society and achieve liberation. In Capital Volume 1, Marx also discusses the concept of primitive accumulation, the process by which capitalism is imposed on non-capitalist societies. He describes it as a violent and coercive process of divorcing the direct producers from the means of production, the land, and then forcing them to sell their labor for wages in order to survive. It entails expelling a resident population from their land and then releasing that land back to them for a price. Native oppression is therefore intimately tied to the development of capitalism, as it's through this process that many Native and Indigenous people have been oppressed and dispossessed. In Marxism and Native Americans, Ward Churchill says, there can be no question that the entirety of the continental United States has been expropriated from its original indigenous inhabitants, with incalculably harmful consequences accruing to them in the process. From a moral perspective, it should be equally clear that no humane solution to the overall issues confronting any American radical can be reasonably said to exist should it exclude mechanisms through which to safeguard the residual land base and cultural identities of these people. So, with these thoughts in mind, I would like to turn to how these concepts played out in Hawaii and the way that the Native people of that land, known as Kanaka Maoli, have resisted and continue to resist to this day. As the history of the colonization of Hawaii is often overlooked, I want to first go over that as quickly as I can. We'll see. So before any settlers came to the islands, there existed a rich economy centered around sharing and caring for the land, a concept known in Hawaii as malama aina. Each land at the time was divided into districts that ran from the mountain to the ocean, and those districts were further divided into wedge-shaped pieces known as ahapua'a. This allowed the people of the land, then known as the maka'ainana, access to all resources that they needed. The core economic unit in Hawaii was the ohana, or the extended family. As in many other indigenous societies, there was no money and no idea of financial profit from economic exploitation. Exchange between different ohana who lived in different parts of the ahapua'a was the main form of economy, and everyone had access to everything they needed through their kinship bonds, which shaped the understanding of the use of land. Elite or monarchs were the rulers of the people. However, unlike many European feudal systems, the Maka'ainana, or the people of the land, did not owe their rulers anything, nor were they particularly bound to that exact place, as there was no concept of land ownership. They could choose to move about freely, and the kings and elite would gain status and material prosperity by having more people living in their domain. This incentivized them to provide for all people and ensured their well-being and contentment. Not doing so would lose them status and respect amongst their community. Through the spiritual and cultural beliefs and practices, the people of Hawaii also felt a direct kinship to the land, and many of their religious beliefs were based on that kinship. The late Hawaiian activist and author, Dr. Haunani K. Trask, writes in her book, From a Native Daughter, quote, "My people believe that all living things had a spirit and indeed consciousness, and that the gods were many and not singular. Since the land was an ancestor, no living thing could be foreign. The cosmos, like the natural world, was a universe of familial relations, and human beings were but one constituent link in the larger family. Thus, gods had human as well as animal form, and human ancestors inhabited different physical forms after death. Nature was not objectified, rather it was personified, resulting in an extraordinary respect for the life of the sea, heavens, and earth. Our poetry and dance reveal this great depth of feeling of love for the beautiful world that we inhabited." So, this one's for you guys. When Captain Cook arrived on the shores of the island of Kauai in 1778, he brought with him the same thing that all colonizers bring to Indigenous people everywhere: Christianity, capitalism, and disease. Within 100 years of his arrival, the diseases that he brought, along with his sailors, had wiped out more than half of the native Hawaiian population, reducing their numbers from an estimated 1 million at contact to less than 40,000 by 1890. I just want you guys to all admire this slide for a couple more seconds. Following quickly in Cook's steps were our favorites, the Americans, who came to the island for two main reasons: Calvinism and sandalwood. By the time they landed on the shores of Hawaii in 1840s, the Hawaiian universe had almost collapsed under the disease brought by Captain Cook's expeditions. Trask mentions in her book that missionary imperialism was mainly successful because they were converting a dying people who were hoping that the promises of eternal life would ease the pain of the destruction of their population. A combination of the missionaries and the greed quickly growing from sandalwood trade and the whaling industry gave way to Americans sticking their grubby little hands into the Hawaiian government, as they do, which by now was a unified monarchy following King Kamehameha's conquest and unification of the islands. Americans began pressuring him for private land ownership. At this time, the president, John Tyler, which I didn't remember at all, issued the Tyler Doctrine of 1842, which was basically like a cease and desist to Europe, saying that Hawaii was now under the sphere of the influence of the United States, and no other nation could interfere with that. By the middle of the 19th century, the Hawaiian chiefs were basically bullied into changing the ways that land was dealt with in Hawaii. And in 1843, Kamehameha III gave in to his American advisors and agreed to a division of the land, an event known as the Great Mahele. At the same time that the United States was marching Indigenous people across the continent in the Trail of Tears, they were also focused on seizing Hawaiian land and beginning to exploit it for profit. By 1888, almost 3/4 of all arable fertile land was controlled by haole, or foreigners. Sugar quickly became king. Sugar plantation owners fought for annexation of Hawaii to the United States because it would help their bottom line by getting around the taxes that they were paying. Throughout the 1850s, this was the main struggle. Sugar companies that desperately trying to pressure the monarchs into annexing Hawaii into the United States, and the various monarchs throughout that decade fighting to hold on to their sovereignty with the backing of their people. In 1887, under the threat from an armed all-white gang of businessmen calling themselves the Hawaiian League, King Kalakaua signed what is commonly referred to as the Bayonet Constitution, as they were all armed. It ceded what is now known as Pearl Harbor to the United States for the use as a naval base in order to get duty-free sugar. It also basically stripped the monarchy of all power, handing it over to business elites and granting voting rights to landowners only. Following the signing of this constitution, a revolution broke out amongst the people, as you would imagine. And America used this as an excuse to land American troops in Honolulu to quote unquote restore order. This was in 1893, and by then King Kalakaua had died as in a tour in San Francisco and was succeeded by his sister, Queen Liliuokalani. She was determined to restore power to the people and give them their rightful place in their own lands. She aimed to write a new constitution that removed the requirement of owning land in order to vote, but her ministry, who had been corrupted by the sugar planters, basically snitched on her. The businessmen and planters organized themselves into what they called a committee of safety and sought military help from the United States minister to Hawaii. So he had the Marines land in Honolulu and recognized this safety group as a provisional government. So in the face of this, with the United States military standing fully armed outside the gates of her palace, Queen Liliuokalani ceded her authority to the United States. In her letter to Sanford Dole, yes, of the pineapples, she basically wrote this statement and he was named the head of government. You can see even in her statement, she's protesting immediately. She says that it's a superior force of the United States, but to avoid any collusion of armed forces and the loss of life, I do under protest and yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall basically reinstate me. So she had hope in the government, which was sad. Ultimately, the monarchy was overthrown and the queen was imprisoned in her palace after a failed uprising of Hawaiians who were trying to restore her. The all-white provisional government named itself the Republic of Hawaii, and Hawaii was annexed into the United States in 1898 under President McKinley. It's important to note that there were no votes about this in the colony or in Congress. The knowledge that this whole thing was unpopular made them just not take a vote. Following annexation and leading up to statehood, America did all the things that they love to do, banned Hawaiians from speaking their own language, banned the hula, banned Hawaiian cultural practices, all things that they now unironically exploit for tourists in the interest of capital. As Honani K. Trask says, as a result of these actions, my people became a conquered people, our lands and cultures subordinated to another nation, made to feel and survive as inferiors when our sovereignty as a nation was forcibly ended, and we were rendered politically and economically powerless by the turn of the century. The history of the colonization of Hawaii perfectly illustrates Marx's concept of primitive accumulation. It's a violent and coercive process by which capitalism is forced upon a non-capitalist society. Like other indigenous populations across the world, Kanaka Maoli have resisted this process at every step. However, the ongoing colonization continues to forcibly remove them from their land, allowing capital to continue to extract resources and leave a path of destruction in its wake. So I'm just going to go briefly over some of the biggest Hawaiian resistance movements, so you can see some of the different ways that they've resisted American imperialism in their communities. So the first big one started in the 1970s while Hawaii was experiencing rapid urbanization and development. Hawaiians protested the spread of urbanization by occupying land, resisting evictions from land, mass demonstrations, and assertions of their culture. The first struggle for this was the 1970 Kalama Valley demonstrations, where the Bishop Estate, who's the largest private landowner in Hawaii, was evicting farmers in order to build townhomes, basically. The struggle against these evictions and further development was a multiracial coalition of not only Native Hawaiians, but locals, people from Hawaii who are not of Native descent, workers, students, and other community members who joined together against the rapid commercial development of Kalama Valley, which is now where Dog the Bounty Hunter lives. The US military is, of course, the largest colonizing force still active in Hawaii today. Throughout World War II, Hawaii was under martial law for 7 years, during which 600,000 acres of land was confiscated by the military for their own use, including a very small island known as Kaho'olawe, which was traditionally venerated by Native Hawaiians as a physical body of Kanaloa, the sea god. During World War II, the US Army used Kaho'olawe as a bombing target to train pilots for their brutal assaults on various places around the Pacific. So this is one example here. In 1976, a group of activists sued the United States government to stop using the land as target practice. This inspired another wave of political activism amongst Native Hawaiians. A group of 50 activists called Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana planned to occupy Kaho'olawe on January 6, 1976. As they made their way to the island, they were intercepted by the military and many were forced to turn back. However, 9 of them successfully landed to begin their protest and occupation against the use of the land by the military. They stayed for a while, but eventually 2 of the activists died under mysterious conditions. They say they were lost at sea, but their activism inspired more people to begin pressuring the government to force the military to leave Kaho'olawe. In 1990, Bush 1 ordered an end to live fire training on the island, and activists have been taking groups there ever since to clean up the debris, unexploded bombs, and other environmental hazards from the island. While this is obviously a huge win for Native activism in Hawaii, the military still owns 22% of the land on Oahu and 5% of all the land across the islands. They have 21 installations, 26 housing complexes, 8 vast training areas, including some on sacred land where former kings have been buried, and 19 miscellaneous bases and operating stations. The majority of this is on so-called ceded land, which was land seized during the original overthrow of the monarchy and put into a trust for private use. The military often pays less than $1 a year to Hawaii for the use of these lands. The most visible struggle in Indigenous activism today is the struggle against the 30-meter telescope, or TMT, on the sacred mountain of Mauna Kea. For Hawaiians, this is the home of Wakea, the sky god, and also one of the ancestors of the Hawaiian people. It's used as a cultural site for praying and does currently have 13 other telescopes on it. Protests against this construction began in 2014, but they gained the most publicity almost exactly 2 years ago when Kanaka Maoli occupied the road leading to the construction site for almost a year. This occupation ended only due to COVID-19 concerns. The construction of this telescope would obviously negatively impact Hawaiian cultural practice, and it also will negatively impact the environment. I mentioned there was 13 other telescopes there, and some of them have already polluted the water. Here's some eye candy. These most recent protests drew tons of attention with Polynesian celebrities such as Jason Momoa and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson spending time with activists and sharing their experiences with their large fan bases. A combination of this heavy publicity and the beginning of COVID-19 put a halt on construction of the telescope for now, which is a huge win. And currently there are multiple lawsuits against the state to try to stop the telescope from being built. I could honestly do a whole presentation on this, but I don't have time. Currently, Hawaii is still being overdeveloped and is facing a surge in tourism amidst a water crisis on Maui, in which the people are being asked to conserve water so that mega resorts have enough water for the tourists. Tourists are flooding the islands with no regard for the land, leaving socks and disposable masks at iconic waterfalls, clogging up the streams and harassing endangered wildlife, like this lady. On Kauai, Mark Zuckerberg has also purchased 1,300 acres of land, including land that was originally sectioned off for Native families since before the overthrow. He was able to purchase this large plot by suing Native families under the protection of a shell company. Kanaka Maoli with claims to that land could either sell to him or try their hand at outbidding a billionaire at public auction. If they lost, they would have had to pay Mark Zuckerberg's legal fees. So clearly he owns all of that now. Kanaka Maoli are the caretakers of Hawaii. They have a familiar bond to the land and live the value Malama Aina, caring for the land as a core principle of their culture and history. As Marxists, we know that fights for liberation amongst the working class must be rooted in the belief of self-determination for all peoples. In his essay, The Question of Peace, Lenin says, quote, "We stand for a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. Imperialism consists of in a striving of nations that oppress a number of other nations to extend and increase that oppression. That is why the question of self-determination of nations hinges on the conduct of socialists in the oppressor nations. A socialist of any of the oppressor nations who does not recognize and does not struggle for the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, including the right to secession, is in reality a chauvinist and not a socialist." As our planet burns and our ecosystem continues to be exploited for capital, it is vital that we talk about solutions to the climate crisis that center on Indigenous nations and their historic right to their own land. Before I wrap up, hopefully I can show a super quick clip of Haunani K. Trask speaking at the anniversary of the 100th year of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. I'm hoping that her passion and her clear love for her people will inspire all of you as much as it has me. So let's see if this works. Everyone cross your fingers.
Not American. We are not American. We are not American. We are not American. Say it in your heart. Say it when you sleep. We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be Americans. The Americans, my people, are our enemies, and you must understand that. They are our enemies. They took our land. They imprisoned our queen. They banned our language. They forcibly made us a colony of the United States. America always says they are democratic. Lies! That is a lie! They have never been democratic with Native people. They have never been democratic with Indians. They have never been democratic with Hawaiians. The United States of America is the most powerful imperialist country in the world. In the world. They control the United Nations. They control the Pacific Ocean. All these nuclear submarines circulating throughout the Pacific. The United States of America is a death country. It gives death to Native people. And the only way to fight the United States of America is to be political. Kue!